Okay, so, precious metals, you might not think of them as like the most exciting market in the world.
Right.
But, when you have a company like AMRK Precious Metals, who has been an authorized purchaser for the U.S. Mint since 1986,
Wow.
like that's decades in this really kind of intricate market.
Yeah, definitely.
And so today we are going to dive deep into AMRK Precious Metals.
Ticker symbol AMRK.
AMRK. And you sent over this great document to help us with this.
It is called AMRK Deep Research Instructions.
Yes. And we are going to try to help you quickly understand this company from a value investing perspective.
We are going to look at the business, of course.
Yeah.
We are going to look at the management, the financials, the market sentiment, the ownership structure.
Exactly. And try to extract like the really key takeaways for you without, overwhelming you with information.
Yeah.
So this is kind of your express route to understanding AMRK from a value perspective.
Yeah.
So we'll start with the business model.
Okay, sounds good.
What do they do? How do they make money?
Well, the first thing that stands out to me when you look at AMRK is just how integrated their business is.
Yes.
It's not just one thing they do. They really have these 5 interconnected segments that all kind of work together.
Yeah, and I think one of their biggest strengths is that they have that wholesale sales and ancillary services segment.
Right.
Which, as we mentioned, they have been authorized by the U.S. Mint since 1986.
A long time.
I mean, that's a huge vote of confidence and a really long track record.
And not just the U.S. Mint. They also have agreements with other sovereign mints around the world.
Yeah.
Australia, Austria, Canada, China, Mexico, South Africa, the UK. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, so they're not just reliant on one mint or one supplier. They're really diversified.
Right, exactly. And that diversification is key in this market because you never know when supply might get tight from one source or another.
Exactly. And this is where, their in-house minting capability, which comes from their Silvertown Mint subsidiary, really helps.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so they're not just at the whim of the sovereign mints. If there's a shortage, they can actually produce their own, bars and coins.
That gives them a lot of flexibility and control over their supply chain.
Exactly. And then, you have the direct-to-consumer segment.
Right.
So this is how they reach, individual investors, collectors, people who are just looking to buy, precious metals.
And they have this multi-brand strategy going on here.
Yeah, they've got a bunch of different brands, JM Bullion, Gold Line, Silver Gold Bull.
Oh, I've heard of those.
You've probably seen them online. They each kind of cater to a slightly different niche within the retail market. Some are more focused on bullion investing. Some are more into collectible coins. They have a whole kind of spectrum of offerings.
So basically, if you're interested in precious metals, you're bound to encounter one of AMRK's brands at some point.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, they have this secured lending segment.
I didn't know they did that.
Yeah, it's through their Collateral Finance Corporation, CFC. And what they do is they provide commercial loans.
Okay.
And what's the collateral?
Oh, I bet it's precious metals.
You guessed it, precious metals and numismatic coins.
That's pretty smart, actually.
It is. They're kind of playing every angle of this market.
Yeah, they're really covering all their bases, it seems.
So if we look at, their key products and services,
Yeah.
It's kind of the obvious stuff.
Gold, silver?
Yeah, gold, silver, platinum, palladium, even copper bullion.
Wow.
Different, forms, bars, wafers, grains, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
They have a huge array of coins. Numismatic coins, bullion coins, and then they have all those ancillary services that we talked about. The logistics, the storage, the minting, the e-commerce platforms, and the collateralized loans.
So it's like a one-stop shop for anything precious metals?
It really is. And, this integrated model is central to their market position and scale.
Okay.
So they were founded in 1965. They've been around for a long time.
They're veterans?
And they've grown into a really leading platform in this space. They estimate that they have like a 6.5% market share of the U.S. jewelry and watch wholesaling market, which is pretty significant.
That is pretty big.
And their customer base and operations are global. North America, Europe, Asia, Pacific, Africa, Australia, they're all over the place.
So they're not just some small niche player.
No, they're a major player, and they've been making some strategic acquisitions lately.
Oh, like what?
So they acquired Spectrum Group International,
I heard of them.
AMS Holding, and Pinehurst Coin Exchange.
Okay.
And these are all kind of aimed at getting them more into that collectible coin market,
Interesting.
which is a higher margin market,
Right.
and expanding their customer base even further.
So it seems like they're actively trying to grow and diversify.
Yeah, they're not content to just sit still. They're really trying to push forward.
And all of this leads to their primary value proposition.
Yeah, what is it that makes them stand out?
Well, I think it's a few things. First off, they're seen as this really comprehensive and reliable platform.
Okay.
They've got that U.S. Mint authorization.
Right.
They have partnerships with all these other mints.
It's a big deal.
That gives them a lot of credibility and trust.
Yeah, and they're not just, buying and selling. They're offering, storage, logistics, financing. It's like a one-stop solution for people in the precious metals ecosystem.
And it seems like they're also embracing technology and modernization. They have their AMRK trading portal and their cyber metals platform.
Yeah, they're not afraid to kind of innovate and keep up with the times.
Right. And of course, they have an experienced team.
Yeah.
And they're making those acquisitions in higher margin areas. So it seems like they're focused on both efficiency and growth.
Okay, so to just quickly recap before we move on, what does AMRK actually do?
Okay.
How do they make money?
So they're a major player in the precious metals market.
Okay.
They buy, sell, store, sometimes even mint precious metals, and they also lend against them.
Yeah.
They're serving everyone from big institutions to individual investors, and they make money through margins on their sales, fees for their services, and interest earned on their loans.
Got it. All right, now let's turn our attention to the people leading this company, the management team.
Okay.
When you're evaluating a company's leadership, one of the first things you look at is their track record.
Right. Experience matters.
Yeah. And in this case, the CEO, Gregory N. Roberts.
Okay.
He's been the CEO since 2005.
That's a long time.
That's a pretty long tenure, and the average tenure for both the management team and the board of directors is also pretty long.
So they have a lot of stability and experience at the top.
Yeah, and, under their leadership, the company achieved record performance in fiscal year 2023, and they've been the ones who have driven these strategic acquisitions we were just talking about.
So they seem to know what they're doing.
Yeah, but here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
The CEO's compensation went up last year, even though the company's earnings actually declined. That's not a great look.
Yeah, and on top of that, several executives and directors have been selling their shares recently.
Oh, so there's some insider selling going on.
Yeah. And, for a value investor who's really focused on trust and integrity,
right,
that raises some questions about, how aligned are the management's interests with those of the shareholders.
That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, it's not like a giant red flag,
right,
but it's definitely something you want to, keep an eye on.
So track record is one thing, but what about their ability to handle challenges and crises?
Yeah, how do they respond when things get tough?
Well, in FY23, they were able to optimize their access to inventory during a period of, market volatility.
Which was pretty impressive because
a lot of companies struggled with that.
Exactly. So that shows some operational competence. And they also have this established framework for managing cybersecurity risks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is super important these days.
It is. I mean, everybody's, a target for cyber attacks these days, so it's good to see that they're taking it seriously. Yeah. What does that framework look like?
Well, they've got, preventative and detective technologies. They do regular third-party audits, employee training, ongoing risk assessments. So they're really trying to cover all the bases.
Sounds pretty comprehensive.
And when it comes to keeping investors informed, they seem to have a pretty robust investor relations program.
Okay.
They've got a website with press releases, financial reports, investor presentations. They do regular earnings calls. The transcripts are available. They provide contact information for investor inquiries. So they seem to be pretty committed to transparency.
Yeah, I like that it's important for a company to communicate clearly with its investors.
It is, but we also have to consider their ethical standing.
Right.
And, they do have a code of business conduct and ethics and a whistleblower policy.
Okay, those are good signs.
And Sustainalytics.
Yeah, the ESG rating company.
Right. They gave them an average rating, which isn't great, but it's not terrible.
Yeah, it's kind of middle of the road.
But here's the thing. In 2022, they had to settle with the CFTC.
The Commodity Futures Trading Commission.
Yes, involving their Goldline subsidiary.
Oh, what happened there?
There were allegations of fraud and illegal commodity transactions.
Yikes.
Yeah. Now, they settled without admitting or denying the allegations.
Okay.
But, this event definitely warrants, careful consideration.
That's definitely a red flag.
It is. So when we look at the management, their honesty, capability, shareholder orientation, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have the long-term experience, the growth strategies, the shareholder returns.
Right.
But then you have that regulatory settlement, the compensation issue, the insider selling. So it's definitely something to weigh carefully.
It sounds like it, yeah.
Okay, now let's move on to the financials.
Okay, the numbers.
Yeah, so we'll start with some key metrics.
Sounds good.
As of early April 2025, their market cap was around $534 million. Their price-earnings ratio, which tells us how much investors are paying for each dollar of earnings, is around 11.81.
Okay.
With a normalized figure of 9.16.
All right.
Their revenue growth has been pretty impressive.
Okay.
For the 3 months ending December 31st, 2024, they saw a 32% increase year over year.
Wow, that's huge.
And for the 6 months leading up to that, it was still a healthy 20%.
Okay.
And over the trailing 12 months, their total revenue was $10.59 billion.
That's a lot of precious metals.
It is. So they're definitely moving a lot of product.
But what about their profitability?
Well, that's where things get a little bit less rosy.
Okay.
Their gross profit margin for the trailing 12 months is only about 1.57%.
That's pretty thin.
It is. And their operating and net profit margins are even lower, around 0.5% and 0.49% respectively.
So they're not making a lot of profit on each sale.
No, and their debt-to-equity ratio, which measures how much debt they're using to finance their assets compared to shareholder equity, is pretty high at 124.32%.
Well, that's a lot of debt.
It is, but on the plus side, they did generate a healthy $137.4 million in free cash flow over the trailing 12 months.
Okay, so they are generating cash.
Yeah. And their price-to-book ratio, which compares their market value to their book value, was below 1 as of April 2nd, 2025, which can sometimes indicate undervaluation.
Interesting.
So to answer your question about profitability and balance sheet strength, they have strong revenue growth, but their net income has been declining recently, and their profit margins are pretty compressed.
Right.
They're generating positive free cash flow, but they also have a lot of debt.
Yeah.
And while the lower PC and PB ratios might suggest undervaluation, there are definitely some areas of concern that you need to look into.
Yeah, things to keep in mind.
Okay, so now let's dive a bit deeper into their financial stability. How consistent have their earnings been?
That's an important question.
It is, and their earnings consistency over the past decade, from 2015 to 2024, has been pretty volatile.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, they've experienced some significant swings in net income.
Okay.
And more recently, their earnings have actually fallen short of analyst expectations.
So they're not hitting their targets?
No, and what about their dividends?
Yeah. Are they paying them out consistently?
Well, they have been paying consistent quarterly dividends since 2021.
Okay.
Which is a good sign for income-seeking investors.
Right.
But the annualized dividend per share has actually decreased recently.
Oh.
And some sources consider their overall dividend track record to be unstable.
So not a sure thing.
No, and then there's that debt issue we talked about earlier.
Right. Their high debt to equity ratio.
They recently increased their trading credit facility to $457 million.
Wow.
Which gives them more access to capital, but their operating cash flow doesn't seem to be covering their debt very well.
That's concerning.
It is, and unfortunately, we don't have enough information to really analyze their working capital efficiency.
Okay.
So based on what we do know, our conclusion regarding their financial stability is that they have a history of fluctuating earnings, and their substantial debt level is a potential risk.
Yeah, those are definitely things that investors need to be aware of.
Now, if you're interested in getting even deeper into AMRK's financials, I want to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, stockanalytics.ai.
Okay.
They provide some really great tools and data that can help you analyze companies in even more detail.
That sounds useful.
It is. So if you're looking for, more financial data analysis tools, definitely check them out.
Okay, we'll be sure to do that.
All right, so moving on to the second half of our deep dive, let's talk about market sentiment.
Okay. How is the market viewing AMRK right now?
Well, recent market sentiment hasn't been too positive.
Yep.
Their stock price has declined by 18%, and they've underperformed both the broader U.S. market and the retail distributors industry over the past year.
So the market's not too keen on them right now.
No, but here's an interesting tidbit. AMRK's stock price has historically sometimes moved inversely to the overall market.
Really?
Yeah. So when the market goes down, they sometimes go up and vice versa.
That's an interesting correlation.
It is, and despite this recent downturn, analysts are actually pretty optimistic about AMRK.
Okay.
The median price target they've set is $43.50,
Wow.
and the average is $42.20, both of which are significantly higher than the current trading price.
So they see a lot of upside potential.
Yeah, and most analysts have a buy or even a strong buy rating on the stock.
So there's a disconnect between the recent market action and the analyst sentiment.
Yeah, exactly. And when we look at recent news about the company, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
You know, the strategic acquisitions in the collectible coin market are generally viewed as positive.
Right.
They're expected to lead to higher margins and a bigger customer base.
Makes sense.
The fact that they're paying a regular quarterly dividend and that they've successfully closed the acquisition of AMS Holding are also seen as good signs.
Okay.
But there is an ongoing merger investigation by Cascilla Law, LLC, regarding the Spectrum deal.
Oh, so there's some legal uncertainty there.
Yeah, and that's never a good thing.
Right.
And then there's the level of short interest in the stock.
Oh, yeah. That's an important indicator.
It is, and it's currently pretty high at 1,464,915 shares as of March 14th, 2025.
Wow, that's a lot of people betting against the stock.
It is the days to cover ratio, which tells us how long it would take for those short sellers to cover their positions, is also pretty high at 6.92.
So that suggests that there's some significant skepticism about the company.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the put-call ratio is 0.35.
Which usually indicates a bullish sentiment.
Right, because more investors are buying call options betting on a price increase than put options.
So we have some mixed signals from the market.
We do. It's not totally clear which way things are going to go.
Yeah, definitely something to watch closely.
Now let's move on to the ownership structure of AMRK.
Okay, who owns this company?
Well, a significant portion of the company is owned by institutional investors.
Okay, how much?
Around 61.15%.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. Some of the major holders include BlackRock, FMR, Vanguard American Century.
Those are some big names.
They are, and while this institutional ownership can provide some stability, it also means that if those institutions decide to shift their positions, it can create some volatility.
Right, because they're trading such large blocks of shares.
Exactly, and we've actually seen some institutions like Vanguard and Praetorian PR LLC reduce their holdings recently.
Interesting.
And insider ownership is also pretty substantial.
How much?
It varies depending on the source, but it's somewhere between 18 and 35%.
Okay.
And some of the key insiders include Ricardo R. Richardson, Gregory N. Roberts, the CEO, and Stephen C. Benjamin.
Okay.
Now, significant insider ownership can be a good sign.
Right, because it means that management's interests are aligned with those of the shareholders.
Exactly, but we have seen some notable insider selling lately by several executives.
Oh.
Stephen C. Benjamin, Barry S. Whitmire, Gregory N. Roberts himself, and Julie A. Taylor Simpson.
That's not ideal.
No, it's not a guarantee that something's wrong, but it's definitely something you want to be aware of.
Right, it's a data point.
Exactly, and the ownership of AMRK is also pretty concentrated.
Meaning?
The top 11 shareholders hold about 51% of the outstanding shares.
Okay.
So that concentrated ownership structure can have both pros and cons.
Like what?
Well, on the plus side, it can lead to more stable control over the company.
Okay.
But it can also mean that there's more price volatility if those big shareholders decide to buy or sell, and it might reduce the influence of smaller shareholders.
So it's a trade-off.
It is. Finally, let's talk about corporate governance.
All right. How do they stack up there?
Well, they seem to have some good things going on.
Right.
They have a majority independent board of directors, an independent board chair, and the chairs of the key board committees are also independent.
Okay, so there's some good independent oversight.
Yeah, and they have a code of business conduct and ethics and a whistleblower policy.
Those are positive things.
So overall, their corporate governance seems to be pretty solid.
Okay, that's good to hear.
All right, so now that we've covered all of that, let's do a SWOT analysis to assess the risks and opportunities for AMRK.
Okay, SWOT analysis. That's a good way to summarize everything.
Yeah, so starting with their strengths.
Okay, what are they good at?
Well, they have a strong established market position.
Right.
Their integrated business model is pretty unique.
Yeah, it is.
They have those long-standing relationships with all those sovereign mints.
Yeah, that gives them a lot of leverage.
And their proprietary minting capabilities through Silvertown Mint give them even more flexibility.
Right.
Their direct-to-consumer segment is well-established.
Yeah, they've been doing that for a while.
And their strategic acquisitions in the collectible coin market are showing promise. And they have a track record of returning capital to shareholders through dividends and buybacks.
So they're shareholder friendly.
They are, but now let's talk about their weaknesses.
Okay, where do they fall short?
Well, their earnings have been pretty volatile in the past.
Right, we talked about
They
that.
have a high debt-to-equity ratio.
Yeah, that's a concern.
Their profit margins have been declining recently.
Okay.
And their operating cash flow doesn't comfortably cover their debt.
So their financial stability is a bit shaky?
It is. And there's
Yeah.
always that issue with the Gold Line regulatory settlement.
Yeah, that's a black mark on their record.
It is. But now let's look at the opportunities.
Okay, what could help them succeed in the future?
Well, the precious metals market is expected to grow.
Okay.
More and more investors are looking to precious metals as a hedge against inflation and economic uncertainty.
Right,
And AMRK is well positioned to capitalize on that.
definitely.
Their expansion into the higher margin collectibles market is also a big opportunity.
Yeah, that could be a big boost to their profitability.
And silver is being used in more and more industrial applications, which could increase demand.
Interesting.
And they could always make more strategic acquisitions to expand their reach and capabilities.
So there's a lot of potential for growth.
There is, but they also face some threats.
Like what?
Well, the price of precious metals can be very volatile.
Right, it's a commodity.
And the industry is very competitive. There are a lot of companies vying for market share.
Yeah, it's a crowded space.
There's always the possibility of stricter financial regulations, which could make it harder for them to operate.
Governments are always trying to tighten things up.
And geopolitical events can disrupt supply chains, which can impact the availability of precious metals.
Yeah, we've seen that happen recently.
And of course, economic downturns could reduce overall investment demand.
That's always a risk.
So to sum up, AMRK is a company with a lot of potential, but also some risks.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
They have a strong business model and they're operating in a growing market, but they also have some financial stability concerns and they face a lot of competition.
So investors need to be cautious and do their due diligence.
Exactly. So given all of that, what do you think is the most critical factor that will determine AMRK's long-term success?
That's a tough question.
It is. There's a lot to consider.
You know, they're making this big push into collectibles, but their core business is still precious metals. And there's that disconnect between the analyst optimism and the recent market performance.
Right. So is it their ability to execute on their strategy?
Yeah.
Is it their ability to manage their debt?
Or,
Is it the overall health of the precious metals market?
or is it something else entirely?
It's a lot to think about.
It is.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
Yeah, we've tried to cover all the key aspects of AMRK based on the research you provided.
And if you're interested in exploring other companies and industries, be sure to subscribe to our show for more deep dives like this.
Just a quick disclaimer. The information we discussed today is based on the sources you provided and should not be considered financial advice.
And AI was used to help us generate the outline for this deep dive.
So do your own research and make informed investment decisions.
Thanks for joining us.
And happy investing.